teaching. So really delighted to have Jess Irish, Katayoun Chamany, and Mev Luna here to spark our conversation. Um, and I think since Katayoun, you are prepared with a spreadsheet, I'll ask if you would be willing to start us off.
Sure. First, thanks. I'm excited to hear what other people are doing around peer learning and peer teaching. So I've been teaching at the new school for 26 years. This is my 27th year. And I've really tried to experiment each time I teach, and in particular in the first year seminar program where I teach at Lang College. So this is a unique environment in which you're helping students make the transition from, I would say, a very highly structured secondary school experience to more of independent learning and responsibility with one another in a peer group kind of learning experience. So I really use a constructivist approach to teaching and learning, and I establish that in my classroom. So peer learning and peer support and peer review are really critical because I'm trying to help the students take on the identity not of student, but as a junior scholar. Like, what does it mean to be a scholar? What does it mean to be a practitioner of something? And so in my first year class and in other classes where students give, presentations at the end of the course, a project or a paper or whatever it might be, I've established a peer review system. So the students know well in advance before they do the assignment that they will be peer reviewed. I explain to them what peer review means in the professional context and how we're adopting and adapting that in this learning context. And then I provide them with a template of prompts that they need to sort of address as they watch their peers' presentations. Then they have a few minutes after the peers presentation to jot down some quick notes, but they also have 5 days to submit the full peer review. And then what I do is, because it's a Google form now, which is great, it all gets dumped into a spreadsheet. So I can actually look at all the data in a spreadsheet, and then I remove the peers' names. And they know that this is going to happen. So they know that their commentary is going to come anonymously to their peers. So they're very honest, they're very forthcoming, they're very constructive in their criticisms if there are any. And then I collect all of that, strip the names off, and then I send it to each student. So each student gets 15, 18, 20 peer reviews from their peers. So I thought I would just show you, not that you need to look at the actual content, but just the degree to which the students take this very seriously. So this is the output of that Google form. So up at the top where it's in gray and in bold, you can see that I have some prompts. What was the best aspect of this presentation? Very simple things. But in my course, there are also learning outcomes. So there are things that the project has to achieve. And so they look at things like justice, art design, the science, the impact, the distribution. Where will this go? How will it make social change? And then things about the nature of the presentation. Was it engaging? Was it strong? Was it creative? And then any open-ended comments that they might have that they would want to give their peer. And then I even have them grade the presentation. So this is clearly like useful for the student. And I emphasize for them, and you can just see like how much they're writing up for each prompt. But what I think is really interesting from my perspective is I teach the students that this is formative assessment, right? They're giving a final presentation, but then they actually have to write a design statement. So whatever, criticism or feedback they're getting has to inform the revision of their design statement. So that's one. Second, I'm going to have to grade them. I hate grading, and memory plays tricks on you, right? Like you might love a presentation and think, oh, this other one was horrible. But what it does for me is it reminds me how other people viewed that presentation. And it reminds me of the very granular, detailed things that spoke to different kinds of students from different perspectives. So it allows me to give a much more thorough, detailed feedback to the student as well, because it jogs my memory and makes me think, oh yeah, okay, I got that too. So I just wanted to show one example of the ways in which I think I've really embraced peer review and peer learning in my classes.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Katayoun. Jess, you want to go next?
Sure, that was really great to see, and I love seeing the comments and um, how you formatted that. That's really great. So I'm Jess Irish. I teach primarily studio classes at Parsons, so that's the context for most of the classes that I teach. And I guess I will kind of speak to a practice that I developed in a class that was sort of a cross MFA, BFA class that was combining generative work that we would do every week. And I think one of the challenges, one of the things that's so important about peer review for all of us is, again, getting outside of ourselves, getting outside of our head, what we were thinking as we were making something, putting it forward in front of a group of people and getting feedback. And it's so important. Right now, I'm teaching first year. So, again, like the first year that you were speaking to, they're used to really structure, they're used to the teacher maybe dominating that. And we're shifting now, and they're all becoming collaborators, and they're becoming those co-authors of what it means to speak to something and how they can present it. So I've become a fan of, and also I'll just call out the wonderful TESOL training program to, in particular, make us really mindful of where it might be really easy, especially for I'm a talker. Some of us, it's like talking comes easily. We can just jump through and think of things to say. Not everybody's like that for a variety of reasons. So combining some time to process, to write something down, and then to share that. So the way I usually like to do that is, um, and I introduced, for when they're doing a creative piece, I tell them we're not going to stand up and explain it and tell everybody what they were thinking. Largely, that's just because that's not how it works in the real world. In the real world, that object or that artifact is going to have to stand on its own, and the viewer or the user comes to it on their own merit. So instead, first we think about what is meaningful language. So for certain terms, such as, "Oh, that's interesting," we're not saying anything is interesting. It's kind of a cop out. We're not saying it's nice, it's cool, whatever. So we sort of generate some kind of generic terms that really don't say much, and think about using much more specific language. But after somebody, let's say we're looking at a group of work or a piece in particular, I'll hand out index cards and I will ask them to write down an observation. And an observation can really just be so simple of, I notice the color blue is really dominant in this piece. Like, I'm noticing the blue backgrounds of the two of my colleagues here. And if everybody's talking about blue, that really tells the maker that that is, a really impactful choice that they've made. So one is a close observation. And I think what is important about that is it's shifting their attention to, what am I? Not judging, but what am I seeing? How can I trust my own eyes and my own response? And, you know, what is the thing that I would like to observe? Again, it's not a value judgment. I think a lot of students in this era are a little nervous about judging each other. So that's kind of an easy thing to do. And we'll do like a warm-up exercise of looking at another work of, what do we notice? What's happening? And then the other thing I ask for is a question. And often this can be where some of the more critical feedback comes into play. I wonder why this was made. I wonder, what inspired this piece. And one of the other things I like to share with them, it's sort of I'll just, I'm not going to get the quote right, but Neil Gaiman, the famous novelist, has this saying of, if 10 people tell you something's working, they're right. But if they tell you how to fix it, they're wrong. And I love that spirit of we're looking for general patterns of feedback. You don't have to take every single comment and say, okay, well, I'm going to fix that. I'm going to fix that. So we're just looking for swaths of feedback. Like everybody commented on the color blue. So did I really mean that to be so important in the piece? Or, everybody commented on, this one thing that they're seeing versus the one-off. So after everybody writes that down, it gives them a little bit of time. Then I have them just read it around the room, because I do want students to become more comfortable sharing their thoughts and just hearing what everybody else did. And then we pass all the cards to the person whose work that was. And I do think that combination of hearing what's in the room and then having that stack where they can review it more closely later. Because often, one person will say a comment and then the listener is like, oh, thinking about that one comment, and like they're not even listening. So, for me, it's been sort of a nice way of getting everybody to participate in some way, and then the listener, the person whose work it was being shared, can ask a follow-up question. So that's a common thing that I've relied on that's been really helpful. Yeah. So I will pass
Yes,
it on.
I could
Yeah.
actually feel when you. I know what you mean about you hear the one comment and your ears just stop working.
Yeah. It's one of our cognitive biases to
Mhm.
attune to the one thing that's not working and ignore all the other wonderful things that are working.
Yep.
So
Thanks.
yeah.
Mev?
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me, everyone. I'm Mev Luna. I'm in the School of Art and Design History and Theory at Parsons. I really appreciated this prompt and invitation because it made me get down to like the baseline of why I do peer assessment and what do I consider meaningful. And I think the biggest thing is thinking about that one is in higher education and education also to understand how they'll operate in the world, but also not to just understand their own interests, but to really be like an active and dedicated peer in general. And so I think for me, the assignments that I give are really about peer learning in terms of applying intellectual effort and generosity to someone else's work to the extent that you might for your own. Obviously, that's not always what happens, but really setting up opportunities for students to understand that their intellectual effort, their intuitive choice making can be applied to other people's processes, and that it's actually quite generous to do that, that the best ideas as a practitioner come through conversation, or as a theorist come through conversation. So I teach really theory practice hybrid courses. And so really using peer assessment as a way to kind of research a topic is something that I integrate. So I'm going to give just a couple of examples. So I teach this advanced research seminar, which is for all Parsons students in visual culture, their junior year prior to thesis. So they're learning, they should have at this point had an introduction to research, but they're really learning how to research a topic in depth and then write a research paper, which is not necessarily what they came to art school for, right? But it's really exciting to get them interested in what these processes can be. And so part of what I have them do is this is actually adapted from another colleague of mine at a different institution, who would have the students come up with the titles for other people's papers or guess what the paper was about. But what I have them do is a bit more intensive, which is every student writes their own annotated bibliography with a certain amount of primary and secondary sources, et cetera. And then I remove the names, and that gets sent to another student. And actually, they write the abstract based on that annotated bibliography. So no one's writing their own abstract. They're writing a speculative abstract about someone else's work. And, I really ask them, I think I would say like 8 out of 10 really take the time to write a really incredible piece that they would use for their own work. But that's really to see that how does the same kind of research or a different brain or a different person's approach or perspective raise to the fore, like something new about the information that's being looked at, basically. So that's one of the more kind of research paper assignments that I give with the speculative abstract. But I also teach this other class that's about artistic research. So how do artists and practitioners research differently than scientists and academics? And it's called materializing citations. And so the point of it is that we spend the first 8 weeks looking at primary sources. So going to archives, research libraries, oral histories, and the students are coming up with their own research topics in the midst of that. And then we move into this period of more experimental research or processing the research information. And a lot of that is based on this kind of peer communication or peer resonances, right? Like a sounding board with peers. And so the first one is they do something that they know. So they interpret a source through an art practice that they already have. But then the second one is they create a methodology based on that art practice that they already have. So how would you translate this methodology that you're using to think through the source material and bring it into an artistic sculpture, for example? Like how are you using that citation to make a score for a music? And so then they have to write out that method. And I remove the names again. I think this is the anonymity is really helpful. And then the second assignment is a delegated method. So I then switch their methodologies. So they're having to, someone gets somebody else's that's completely different that they have to use to interpret a different primary source material. And so really that is like a way to think that everybody in the classroom has something to bring. Also, I find that everybody has something to contribute that is different from each other, and that we learn best when we're willing to kind of take on other people's methodologies and perspectives and play. And then the very last one is that we do a group reenactment. So they work in groups, and the biggest point on this is that the rubric also allows for a large part of their grade is on how much they were willing to be influenced by the input of others. So it's not so simple as they look at a primary source and they write a script and everybody acts it out. It's okay, how do we reenact? There's many ways to reenact. And then what are these other two people that are in the reenactment process of this primary source doing? So for example, some of this has been to stage an event that is a recreation based on, a picture, an image. That's kind of a more baseline reenactment that we know. But another one was actually the student. I thought this was completely brilliant. The student wanted everybody to, she was working on like these blackout poetries. And so she wanted everyone to make one. And so she like brought in that and then had everyone make these pieces. And then also part of that was coloring in or recreating the veneer for these like antique artifacts that she had found. So there was like this more creative way to think about reenactment. So yeah, so really like I do other kinds of peer assessment, but I really wanted to think creatively about this topic as well, of like what is at the baseline, why do we even have peers in higher education? We are learning in a social environment for a reason, and how can peer assessment and meaningful feedback really activate that in a way where it's not just students aren't just looking at me in conversation, they're looking at each other more so than they're looking at me. To me, that's how I know a classroom is working really well, when they're not raising their hands and looking at me, but they're just engaging with each other. So yeah, so thanks for letting me share these thoughts.
Fantastic. These are really fantastic. So we'll just open it up to questions, sharing other practices. Katayoun, I wonder if I could ask you, because you were very specific to say this is formative assessment, and I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about how you help students understand the distinction between formative and summative assessment or evaluation.
Yeah, sure. I think what I try to go back to that whole idea that Mev just brought up. Why do we do work in community? Why do we even have a professional society or an affiliation with a particular group. Why do we do writing circles or crits? Why do we care what people think about what we're doing? I think some of that is performative, and I'm honest about that with them, especially in the natural sciences where I teach. Citations are everything. That's how you get grants, that's how you get reputation, that's how you get prestige. So we talk about why one might want to be assessed by their peers, and what does it mean to be assessed formatively versus being assessed evaluatively. So the idea that the number of citations that you have in the Web of Science, for instance, might make you a more competitive grant writer, or get a prestige for an award, or get a promotion at work. We talk about that being evaluative, but then we also talk about the value, for instance, at least in my field, often scientists will present their work in a poster or in a oral presentation before they publish a research article or patent something or whatever it is they're doing. And we talk about how critical people can be in those spaces. It's not unlike an art crit, where people really rip you to shreds in a public forum. And the kind of thick skin that one has to develop, because they are not evaluating you, but they're actually trying, as Mev said, to elevate your work, to help you think about the choices that you made. And as Jess said, was that actually your intent, to be all blue, or did you miss the mark because that's what everybody's seeing, but that wasn't your point? And so I really try to help them understand how that's formative. It's informing the next iteration of whatever it is they're going to develop or proceed with. So that's how I try to distinguish the difference. And I have to say, they all have heard of peer-reviewed articles. They don't actually understand what that means, and they think that somebody's paid to do it. So then I also explained to them about how some of this is about, a bit of a moral imperative about also upkeeping the standards of the profession, that it is gatekeeping. So it's evaluative at that level. And what does it mean to be a gatekeeper? Who gets to be a gatekeeper? Is that appropriate in this space? And why would we even want to have any gatekeepers, if at all? And what open access looks like with peer review, as opposed to, an editorial board or something like that. So I used to do much more of this in a research methods class that I taught. You're actually forcing me to realize I need to be more intentional in these other courses, and maybe spend a little bit more time talking about why we do this, how it's done in the profession, and how it's done in a learning space. So thanks for giving me these reminders and this pause to really think about how I can bring some of this conversation back into the space. The other thing I wanted to mention is, Mev, I loved your creativity of your approaches. They're so interesting. I'm going to take those ideas away. But I remembered a while back, I used to have students co-write a paper, and that's really challenging. But I would use RefWorks, the bibliographic software that they have access to in the library, and they would create a password, a shared password, and a shared login. And so any of the references that they were researching, both peers, the two peers, would have to annotate the reference. And so it kind of reminded me of your reconstruction of the abstract based on somebody else's bibliography or the methodology. So really, thank you again for reminding me of that.
Yeah, Katayoun, I think if I can respond to, I feel like seeing this, I love a spreadsheet so much. And I think one thing that you reminded me is the value of peer assessment as an educator, right? That we then can see through, not to be vision forward, but we see through 18 people's eyes, or we understand something through 18 people's instead of just our own. And so it's this nice kind of also feedback for ourselves to kind of have that to look at when giving feedback. And Jess, I also just really appreciate the emphasis on observation and talking about what's in front of us, because I think one thing that can happen so much is also students are thinking about, they're also thinking about theory, they're thinking about the conceptual, they really, I feel like, can get really caught up in what their intentions were. And I think understanding that objects, that paper, that everything has its own life, and that once it's outside of you, you can't go around and tidy it up, right? Like it makes its own mess in the world, it does its own thing. And that part of releasing something into the world is also allowing it to have its own life and seeing where that life takes it. And so, yeah, I really appreciate that, Jess, that it's also part of first year at Parsons, that they're really like looking at, well, what's right actually in front of us, and what is this thing doing versus what do I want it to do, or what do I think it's doing. So that was really interesting too.
Yeah, and also like, how do I describe that? How do I put language to that? That's sort of that close looking. It's so important.
When we do presentations as part of Universal Design for Learning, if we're using an image, we will try to remember to describe it. And it's really extraordinary what happens when you describe as opposed to just looking, as Jess, as you said, when you have to put it into words, you really see it differently. And I highly recommend it as a practice.
Yeah, it is a practice of like, you know, choosing the right vocabulary. Because again, I think across any of the majors that any student would be doing here, expanding one's vocabulary as well as listening to that peer feedback is sort of a core learning outcome. One other thing I was going to share that I'm actually doing it in my current class. I'm teaching a class in sustainability, sustainable systems in the first year, and we're doing a debate, which is really fun. So again, very different energy because again, there will be a winner. There's 2 debates, 2 topics. We're practicing the idea that you might have to make a case for something that you actually don't agree with, but you're going to do it anyway. And you're researching. Yeah, I think I'll probably do cookies instead of ribbons. But I do a feedback form we have another class come in and they're going to act as judges. But anytime that there is a collaboration, I think collaboration is one of the learning outcomes that we do see. It's so important to so many fields, yet how do we make that go well, which is really hard. Again, based on personalities and circumstances and maturity levels and commitments. And that could be a whole nother faculty review conversation. But where I do have, and I do think a lot of courses require some element of collaboration, wherever possible, I like to have the student feedback actually determine part of the grade. Not all of it, but part of it. So for example, this debate, they're working in teams of 4, and half of their points will come from their other, just to say, of the 10 points you get, 5 of those are from your peer people. So if you flake out and you don't help research and you don't help make the presentation, and that's going to show up. And that's just, again, they get that because they all know what it's like to have somebody who was a bummer or who flaked out or whatever. So giving them some agency, and of course it's important to let them know what that is. And then I'm pretty generous in doing the other 5 points. If you can get up there and serve, because it's terrifying for most of them, they have not done it. So they get the 5 points just for going through it and doing it. And then we'll review the written feedback, but looking at were there logical fallacies, what was the tipping point that made the case for this one issue. And these are all environmental issues. So there are cases to be made on either side. Nothing is so black and white. That's another of the learning outcomes is looking at that complexity and embracing it. And offering substantive evidence for that. So yeah, just the collaboration, making that participatory was something I also wanted to share.
Jess, I really appreciate you talking about the sustainable debates. I mean, I think that's such a challenging thing for people to do because it's such a big topic and you have such a short period of time to try to prepare something. One of the things that I've done actually to sort of emphasize the peer interaction in that kind of space is I've actually moved away from debate. And I give them a document that talks about the distinction between discussion, debate, and dialogue. And I emphasize the dialogue because I have found that when I do debate, they might be collaborating with their four, but they're not collaborating with the rest of the class. And so if I emphasize dialogue as where can you find places of commonality, agreement, compromise with the other side, they're much more likely to, in a sense, be collaborating intellectually or maybe even through methodology with the other side who's coming from a very different perspective, and they have to listen because they're not going to be able to make that connection if they're not actually listening to the other side. And I find that with the debate, because they do want the ribbon, I saw the ribbon and the cookies, because they want to win, they're so compelled by winning, they're always prepared for what they're going to say, and they're not really listening to what the other person's saying, or even thinking about how did the other person arrive at that set of values or positionality, what informed that positionality, how could I have more empathy to understand why they've taken that position, even if I disagree with it, and that's, I think, a different way to do kind of peer learning is to sort of broaden out your tentacles, if you will. And it's a really difficult skill to teach them. But I found it useful.
I think this leads.
We've been trying to emphasize exactly the distinctions that you're making, especially around, talking about the hard stuff, and people are so not listening and not hearing. And one of the things that we sometimes advocate for is designating a class skeptic who, for that class period, their job is basically to argue the other side of everything. And the value of it for peers is that they know that they're not advocating from what they really think, but it's their job to argue. So I don't know if you've experimented with that or if that's helpful in the context that you're talking about.
Yeah, actually, I used to have this thing about seminar, and one of the roles was devil's advocate. And the students are so, they're so social justice critical. I love it. One of them said to me, "Why do you call it devil's advocate? It's a negative framing of the opposition." And I was like, "Oh, good point. I should call it skeptic or, opposing view or something like that." And so, they really are thoughtful about this and how one frames it.
Yeah, I was thinking about this other part of peer work that we're kind of getting into the underbelly of, which is conflict and learning from conflict. And I'm thinking also, Jess, you know this course very well, integrative studio and seminar. We're in first year program where there is a section that's called multiple perspectives. So it's very much everyone teaches a formulation of a group project or collaboration in the first semester of their school, of their time at Parsons. And one thing that I did for that is so it's fun because you can do whatever kind of assignment you want. So I have them create a collective, some kind of collective that's organized around an issue. It can be a real issue, an imagined issue, something historic, something in the future. It's really up to them to decide what their core values are. And in particular, I'm putting students, they're all from different disciplines. So I'm putting students who aren't the same, right? So it's not a homogenous group, it's a heterogeneous group. And so then the other thing is that at the very start, while they're deciding their topic, I also have them decide a group structure for making decisions. And the code for making decisions is conflict, right? Because anytime a decision has to get made, everybody has different commitments, different things at stake. And so there is going to be some kind of something that arises. So either it's a conflict, which is like full blown, or a rub. But either way, that rub is the teaching moment, and they have to do that work on their own without me. And I think so that's the point of them deciding on these group structures. So I basically go through like, here's Robert's law, here is like, direct democracy, indirect democracy, representative democracy, consensus based. Here's how so consensus based takes longer, but or information based decision making processes. So I give them all of these group structures, and then they choose. They choose if they want to be a consensus collective, if they want to be someone who has a president, a vice president, if they want to be somebody who has a committee who makes that decision. And then, about halfway through the assignment, we do a workshop on conflict. Okay, what came up for everybody? Understanding that it's actually not something to avoid, but it's like a part of the collaborative process. So they end up making great things. And of course, it can be really hard. I think the absent person in a collective is probably the hardest to address, because they're not always there even to address their absence. So that tends to be like the most difficult thing. But in terms of other types of conflicts that arise, they have that structure to lean into ahead of time. They've decided it when they're not upset with each other or frustrated with each other. And it's something for them to look at when they are, that's like in place. And then of course, then we talk about it when I'm there as well. But I found that has been really helpful, because they have that kind of agreement to go back to, when they're like 3 weeks into the project, as opposed to like right when they're in, a honeymoon phase, so to speak, at the beginning.
Rita, do you want us to give more examples, or could we ask Paul or Carrie, or the Carries? There's 2 Carries, it looks like. If what their practices are, and if they want to contribute something.
I was just going to sit here in silence and see what arose.
Okay.
Hi, sorry, I was late, so I didn't hear the first half. So same here. I just wanted to attend and try and soak in as much as I can from the topic. So thank you.
Carrie, I'm going to try to summarize Katayoun's, and then I'll hand to Paul, because Katayoun teaches a first-year seminar at Lang, and uses a Google form in which all students provide peer feedback in response to questions that she's indicated in the form, including the specific questions like around equity and justice. I'm going to forget what some of the others were. And then a little bit of mostly it's formative feedback, but a little bit of it was evaluative. I noticed the example that she shared, everybody said strong, 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 strong. And then they're even asked to give an A. And one of the values is that students are hearing from 18 different people. The peer responders have, I think, about a week to provide their written response so they can think about it and they have time to work on it. Very, very thoughtful. And then when the time comes for the instructor, actually has all those responses to remind you of, oh, these are what other people thought, so that you're mitigating your own sort of biased memories. That was a very, very rough summary of what I heard. Paul.
Hi, thank you so much. I've heard so many good things already that can help me. The idea of swapping work, super cool. Index cards and having them write and then verbally share from Jess, really cool. Katayoun, the Google form, super helpful. I liked the designated skeptic too, that was cool. So thank you. I had a few questions and reasons why I wanted to come. The first, I suppose this is my first semester teaching one of my courses online, and it's interesting, they're so much more shy. I don't know if they self-selected online and that's just part of who they are, but unfortunately the class every week they bring progress on different assignments, and then a lot of the class is dedicated to giving each other feedback. So some of what I've heard today, I think can help me, but I was wondering if there were other tips to encouraging them to open up and give feedback with online instruction. That's my first question.
Can I ask Paul what is the age range? What's the grouping?
Yeah, this course is primarily graduate students.
Okay. So breakout rooms are great. And what I'll do is I'll put them in smaller groups. It's just like in a classroom, they just are easier and like can be groups of 3. And then I'll bop around and it announces when you drop in, or you can set it so it announces. And I just see that, you know, I give them, if I really want to see that they're having a generative conversation, I might have them answer questions and send them back to me. But I'll just like drop in, and I find that that also helps them to like kind of get to know each other. This is maybe not as appropriate for graduate students, but I find when we moved online for the in first year, and I was also teaching online in first year, I always think it's a great pedagogical practice in order to get people to talk to each other, to have everyone embarrass themselves the first day, or, you know, kind of consistently. And so what I would do is we would do kind of like, I don't know if anyone watched like Sit and Be Fit, but we would arrive to the Zoom room, I'd put on music, and then everyone kind of does like a stretch that feels good to them. And then non-verbally, so strengthening kind of this non-verbal relationship, someone else would do a different movement, and then the whole screen would move and people are laughing and it's silly, you know? So again, I don't know how apt graduate students are to that, but I found that that just like cut through the screen, right? Because we're all like sitting in these meetings, and it also had us arrive together. But then the secondary kind of thing, you know, they may think I'm just being silly, but really the pedagogical undertone is having them take cues from each other on a screen without speaking. And I find that that really kind of congeals a classroom in a really interesting way when it's only online.
I'm actually thinking you could do that in the classroom, and I think I'm going to do it this week, like because they don't pay attention.
Yes, I do it in the classroom.
Right, to body language, and I keep saying to them, like, just pay attention to what's going on around you, like, you know. So that's really great, Mav. Such a good suggestion.
Mev, could you actually lead us in that right now, if people wouldn't mind?
Okay, is everyone up for it? Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay,
that would be so fun.
Cool. So, what I'll do is I'll play a song because it's just a little bit nicer, and then I'll start us off. And so yeah, you can just sit if you want. And how it'll work is I'll do a stretch that feels good, and everyone will do it. And then whenever the next person wants to go, you just jump in with another stretch. So we'll do it that way. Okay. So, and if you want to opt out, you can turn off your video. Square. Okay, let me share music, and I'll mute.
You gotta love the new school, man.
yeah, so that's that.
Fabulous.
And now we've all arrived and everyone's embarrassed themselves. And so then they can
Oh, it's
talk
so fun.
freely, you know.
No, and I
says
love
what to
that everybody's
move.
getting out of them. They're just looking and responding, you know, getting out of your head and worrying about what you're going to say. You're just, you know, it was really fun.
I thought it was kind of funny that because we're all maybe, I don't know, professors and not students, who knows, but it did seem like we had a lot of leaders. Like there was a lot of like changes at once. And I thought, oh, that's an interesting thing to have to manage, right? It was sort of
It's
interesting.
true. They tend to be a lot shyer. So like you'll be doing one thing for a really long time and it's excruciating. Whereas here I was having to like look and be like, okay, wait, where is the new movement?
It's fun.
Thank you. That's super helpful. My next idea is specific to non-native English speakers. I've noticed in my one course this semester, I have a student particularly struggling with verbal feedback. And so I feel like I need to quickly introduce something to our course to make sure their feedback is written, sort of tips around that.
I'll speak to that, Paul. So again, I'll just promote the incredible, it's a TESOL methods course. They usually offer it in June as an intensive and also in January. It's on Zoom. And one of the things that's so fun is that you develop a lesson plan incorporating all the principles, and then you do it with your peers. And then they critique it. So, you know, again, it gives you the opportunity to kind of be the student of how that went. But two things that I've really taken away from that, I mean, so many things, but in particular is for students, English as a second language, we can often not even be aware of what we know success. What does success look like? And so this idea of like showing them the model. So in particular, like when I did teach a seminar, I showed them a couple of different passages on the same assignment and you know, anonymous. And then we just talked about, again, the tone was different, the style was different, the approach was different, but what was working well in each one or what wasn't working well in each one, just so that they could, again, see an example. And before that, I had really kind of avoided doing that because it was sort of like, well, you know, and I think a lot of creative faculty are like, I don't want to tell you what to do. So then they leave this really open-ended kind of, what is success? So I really took that to heart, showing them some examples. And again, you know, being intentional to show a few things so that it doesn't become, here's what I want. And then the other thing that I think also really works well with the breakout rooms is as you're giving them, let's say, a passage of reading, or you're watching a short film, or you're listening to a lecture, it could be anything. Tell them what it is that you want them to focus on. And so, for example, I like showing this one short film, and then I'll give like pairs. You guys focus on this part, you guys focus on this part. And so they're watching all the same thing. And then they have to like determine what were the visual elements, what were the sound elements, what were the whatever. And then we can share it back. So it kind of gives them a job to do. Again, just assuming there are so many things to talk about in any given problem or piece or situation or whatever. But I found that to be really helpful. And in particular for the breakout room, where it's like, okay, your job is to do X, Y, and Z, then they are, you know, because often, you know, they get shoved in there. And then the first thing they do is, what are we supposed to be doing? You know, it's always this question, why are we here? You know, which is usually why you pop in and you're like, does everybody know what you're doing? So making that kind of clear in a slide or something where it's like, here are your jobs. And then you'll be doing something like reporting back or writing this thing or whatever. But I found really embracing those two principles has been really helpful for me.
Katayoun.
So I don't have a lot of students who are English as a second language. I sometimes do, but what I do have are students who don't learn through text. So I can show another share screen here. So let's see. It says start sharing screen will stop others' computer sound share. So I think Mev, you might still have sound share on. Is that okay if I?
Yeah, I turned it off.
Okay. All right. I'm gonna see if I can pull this up. Give me 2 seconds. Sorry. So what I often do is I give students sometimes a mind mapping assignment. And some of my students are not text savvy. And so you can see this is a group one, where one of them was very savvy with a technological tool that helps them do mind mapping. Obviously, it's very beautiful. But others did hand-drawn mind mapping. And a lot of them, I encourage them to use visuals, not text. And so you can see that one of the visuals that they really liked from one of the contributors actually made it to the collective group mind map. This isn't the greatest mind map example, but you'll see sometimes it's conglomerate of like visuals and snatched images from the internet or from the resources that they got, literally placed into this collective. So the idea here is, like this assignment was about cystic fibrosis. It was in a genetics course, and they're connecting to biological topics, but they're also connecting to social issues and to some of the different things at different levels of scale. So like this is obviously very large scale, lung and liver issues, but then this is at the molecular and cellular scale. So I think allowing them to play around with how they demonstrate or understand their knowledge or make connections, whether it's through visuals or some construction, is really important regardless of what their language skills are.
Yeah, and I was also thinking about how that relates to like intertextuality, right? Like how we read between text. And I think that especially because I teach visual culture, I love visual culture. Like there's so many different ways to think about things that I actually do this less in the peer, but I think it could be applied here. Inviting people to bring in other references that it makes them think about. So that could be a meme, it could be an article that they were listening to, it could be a podcast, it could be an image, it could be a film sequence, it could be, right? And then also what you're doing there is you're allowing them to make these connections when they're just out in the world, which is where also I think great ideas come from. And then the kind of subtext for that is that they're learning this kind of the baseline of intertextuality and like how to think across different texts together. The other thing I will say that I actually use this, I have tendonitis, and so typing is very challenging for me. So I don't type my feedback to students. I do a rubric. Everyone has like the rubric, and then I leave extensive notes and a voice memo because everybody has a phone and it's easy to record. So I just talk to the student like I'm giving them feedback in the classroom. And then if I use Canvas a lot because it's has a lot of amazing things happening in there. But you can just attach the file. So I'll save, I'll just do I'll do the voice recording on my phone, save the person's name and the project, I'll upload it and I'll say additional feedback in there. I have had, when I was teaching online, I had the students do that for each other. And it's another way to really kind of for them to feel like they're getting to know each other, but you're also not on the spot. You can re-record if you want. Someone could be, I always wing it, but other people could look at their notes or write something and record it. And then just having someone's voice when you give feedback or when you're receiving feedback is just a lot nicer than communicating or trying to figure out how to communicate delicately or critically in like a notes kind of way.
I think that's a really fantastic, positive, and very meaningful suggestion on which to conclude. This was terrific. Thank you so much to our facilitators, Katayoun, Jess, and Mev. And for our participants, thank you for joining us. And those of you listening online, I hope you found this helpful.
Thank you.